vouch for what Valerie said about Brian. He's really probably our top expert on in the field validation approaches and what works and what doesn't work in different situations. So I'm glad that he's joined me today to be available to answer questions and maybe share some of his perspective. Speaking of which, here's the brief overview of the presentation that I'm going to give today on lean validation. And as you can see, I'm just going to cover a little bit of background and historical perspective related to how things were and how things are now, and why, a little bit of why, how the regulatory landscape has shifted over that time, and going into the guiding principles and documents that have shaped that. After that, I'll focus more on what lean validation concepts really are, and then get into what the key features and benefits are. Focus on how you can save money by taking on these approaches, and share very briefly on at least one of our successful case studies in which we were able to implement templates and procedures, et cetera, that help the company achieve their goals and following these lean validation models. And then finally, we'll hopefully have time to take questions and talk with those of you in the audience. And by the way, I really appreciate you guys spending your time with us today. So welcome, and let me get right into it. As many of you may know, but I'd like to just go over a little bit. Really, a lot of what is relevant to us now came about because of sterility issues that were encountered in the 60s and 70s in the U.S. In using parenteral drugs. And I won't go into some scary stories about the quality issues and what became of some of those people and the children, et cetera. But obviously, it was a public safety risk, and it was just determined that the reason that these things were happening is that there was not enough quality kind of baked into the overall manufacturing process and drug development process for the industry. So the FDA came along and put into place validation finally as a GMP requirement. And in 1987, the FDA published their first process validation guidance, which really gave us a lot of the core principles and practices that a lot of companies, even to this day, are still using, or at least kind of have the predecessors of what their current models are based on. What happened over time, though, is in the 1990s and going into the 2000s, the manner in which companies kind of try to emulate each other and outdo each other and keep the C and CGMP relevant by trying to stay current, they really stepped up their game but as is typically the case, they kind of overshot the mark. And so going along into the 2000s and so on, all of a sudden we had these cases in the early 2000s, late 90s, where validation was an exercise in creating books and books and books of paper and testing every single thing that you could possibly think of, not considering whether any of those items always had a quality impact or ultimately an impact on patient safety, and just kind of making sure that they covered everything. And part of that was because they thought they had to. So you can see on the timeline, though, late 2000s, we have this ASTM standard, E2500, that we'll get into later, but it's really a lot of the core of the lean validation concept. And prior to that, the ISPE actually had a commissioning and qualification baseline guide that was what the driver was for that ASTM standard. So like I said, the evolution of how we got there, and in general how I think the industry responds to FDA and other regulatory bodies, is that you get a regulatory action, you respond with excessive documentation. All of a sudden they're overwhelmed because they have too much paper to review, and industry itself is overwhelmed. They don't have enough quality resources and validation staff to do everything that's required. And finally, with the global harmonization efforts, you end up with some documents that are listed in here. So the ICH Q8, Q9, Q10, 11 documents, like I said, ASTM E2500, some of the other things listed here all are really, I would say, contributors, or certain elements of which are in the lean validation concept. So regulators really came out and said, we want you to embrace innovation and continue to evolve. And you see here this mess of bubbles trying to overlap each other, but I think that's really what things are about. Is it takes a lot of effort and energy to find what everything has in common and bring out the best principles in all. And at the bottom, you end up with a robust quality system that really does take into account everything that is really necessary, and thanks to global harmonization efforts, is acceptable these days to justify your validation effort and ultimately save money by not doing a lot of activities that previously had been done, and I know are still currently being done in a lot of companies out there. So I guess the question, though, this one's only hypothetical, but are we still documenting too much? And I think the answer is yes, definitely yes. From the clients that I've visited, and I'm not saying everybody out there is not on the path to lean validation, but we do see quite a few companies that have really no understanding of what current lean validation concepts are and how they can take advantage of them. Or in certain cases, they have heard of it and they think, well, we're not going to leverage. Oh no, let's leverage. Okay, where the idea of leveraging is just really just an idea and not really in their procedures, and so they don't really they don't have the confidence, and the QA management doesn't feel that it's acceptable. So they still over document even if they're aware of it. For the FDA's perspective, really the current state is overly conservative, and a study that they conducted, or they, I guess, commissioned, found that the industry is wasting tons and tons of money every year through misplaced decision making, usually on the conservative side, through fear of regulatory action, to overdo everything to make sure that they comply. And as the FDA has said in this, it's a quote, the desired state will be realized upon establishing robust quality systems. So if you have the right quality system, you can get rid of a lot of excessive documentation. Here's a list of what I see as the common drivers of excessive documentation, and what we see out there when we work with our clients, and try to counsel our newer clients when we meet with them. First of all, like I said, overly conservative QA regulatory practices. The procedures as such are usually outdated. Skipping around a little bit, actually, the ISP C&Q baseline guide actually has version 2, and in fact, I just sat through a webinar today on that. So the good news is that ISP has come along, and they're still, in certain ways, driving change. But at the moment, a lot of companies are still really basing their documentation system on the first guide, which requires using the V model and really going through everything, system level and component level impact assessments for everything, and it really drives a lot of excess cost. The last couple I'd say really are uninspired management, and really I wonder out there, and I think we have a question coming up, but how many of you really feel like you have the right leadership in your company that is not only coming to work just to kind of make things happen or move on, but really is inspired to embrace change, and then without too much fear of regulatory action. I mean, all of us should have a healthy fear of the regulators, and obviously the closer we get to doing things the wrong way or taking more risk, the more fear we should probably have. That's normal. But a lot of times you're overly conservative management because they irrationally believe that anything they do may be something that they'll be in trouble for. So having said that, I wanted to ask the audience here, what is your biggest challenge when it comes to lean validation? And I am going to switch to the poll. and try to give you poll questions. It's working. I don't know.
So a couple more seconds here, and we'll close the poll. So if you haven't voted, you've got about 5 seconds to go ahead and put your answer in, and we'll take a look at the results in just a second.
Okay, good to
All
know.
right, and closed. All right, so we're gonna share those results now.
How do we do that?
All right, so you should be able to see about 8% of you said uninspired management. About a third of you said overly conservative QA and regulatory practices. 26% of you said fear of regulatory action, and around 30% said outdated, poor validation procedures, and 5% said other. So good feedback there. Thanks so much. We'll have a couple more poll questions later in the presentation.
Thank you. You may need to tell me if I'm doing something wrong.
No problem.
Because I am not, I apologize to the audience if you see that I can't move this forward, but I'm trying to move forward.
No problem. And I can switch to my screen too, Jeff, if you're having some issues.
Well, I am trying to move it forward and it's just not moving. Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry. I guess it's working better. Okay. So moving forward, currently, here's a list of what our current best practice documents are. And really, the point is just to list them out. I'm sure most of you are familiar with almost all of these. And you see here's another list to keep it going. And so if you add all those together, I think you've got to have at least about 14, 15 different documents. And the point of all that is really we need it to stop. A lot of those documents may exist in current models, but a lot of them don't. And when they do, they're not nearly as heavy as they would be or usually are. So obviously the question always is, well, we need it to stop, but how? How do we do it? How do we do it so we don't get in trouble? How do we do it so everyone knows how to do it the right way and really understand it? So, so listing these out really is, these are the things that enable us to embrace change and to understand that the global regulatory bodies out there have embraced this, as a collective. Sure, there are differences in the EU and the FDA, but really these global, these documents, like even the new ISPs, Guide number 2 or the ASTM E2500, that's really the whole point, that it's a global standard. And so we don't need to worry about whether or not it will be embraced in a different country that your company may be manufacturing or trying to distribute products in. So in order to move forward, how do we do that? Well, we have to eliminate fear of change. And so how do we do that? Well, we have to partner with the industry, move forward courageously, right? Because it's almost like you're hoping that the regulators aren't pull the rug out from under us and tell us one thing's okay and not allow it. But you got to do that and be brave and move forward courageously in order to move change. So with that, I have another poll question, and I wanted to ask basically, how overall does your organization have a fear of change? And then the poll, which I cannot control the poll.
And let's see here. We'll give about another 20 seconds for everyone to chime in with their response. We have a clear leader, right? Well, I don't know. It's kind of half and half here now. It's very interesting. We'll share those results in just a second here. About 10 more seconds. And then we're going to close this poll. So please provide us with your feedback. We love to know what everyone thinks. All right, so last second, and we're going to close this poll out.
Gone.
And let's share those results. Jeff, are you able to see the results on your
No,
screen?
I am not.
Oh, well, then it's straight to you. Hopefully everyone can see these results. If not, I'm going to go through them anyway. But overall, does your organization have a fear of change? 18% of you said very much. 45% of you said somewhat. 5% not sure. 27% a little. And 5% none at all. We love change. So
Oh, wow.
the clear winner here is everyone's got it dealing with a little bit of fear of change. Obviously, that's a huge issue in any organization, but
Right.
but that is definitely our clear winner today. All
Okay,
right.
well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let me try to move this forward without hiccups. There we go. So after eliminating fear of change, or at least chipping away at it, the second task really is to streamline your process. And like I said, when you do change, you want to make sure that people can do it over and over and do it the right way. And so the first thing you got to do is start from the top, and with policies, procedures, and then ultimately, like we usually call it within compliance team, gold standard templates. And that's really been one of the areas that we've excelled in and gone back to over the years. Is let's just create the best template out there and use it to drive change and to show people how to do this properly and minimize costs associated with it. So what the main thing that the global community has embraced is the risk-based, and I should add science-based approach, where you're essentially always need to be assessing the risk of your decisions and the risk of the actions or the non-actions that you're going to take in terms of qualifying your equipment and your facilities and everything that gets associated with that as it drives toward ultimately process validation. If there's low risk for certain items, then many items don't even need to be qualified. They can be commissioned only, and on and on. So focus on critical aspects. Today I heard a term in the ISP webinar that seems to be somewhat new, so I'll just share it. Critical design elements. And it, I think many of you may have heard about CPPs and CQAs. CPPs being critical process parameters that drive toward critical quality attributes, which are essentially the critical attributes that are measured usually from QC and different aspects of your drug product or whatever you're measuring to make sure it's pure and safe and has the right quality. So, and then of course, direct impact versus indirect impact quality should be the driver for most of your decisions. One thing we've had that contributed to this, and it's still, it's more in the I'd say in the 2000s and going up through now, but it's a little bit dated, as you can maybe see, but it really is one of the drivers for how these things got going. But really the objectives, which I'd like to breeze through a little bit, really show you that the FDA was encouraging early adoption of technology, and they didn't want technological changes to be, to not happen because companies were afraid of how they would document it or how they would justify it. So they encouraged the risk-based approach and ensured that the inspection policies are based on the same set of principles that they were encouraging industry to embrace, so that they wouldn't have inspectors going out there and knocking people down for the same things that they were encouraging. And then, of course, enhancing consistency and coordination of all of the regulatory programs. So once again, they don't send the wrong message. An example from the EU Annex 15 for Europe is the same thing. It's focusing on critical aspects. So you see the same language mirrored in different regulatory requirements. And similarly here in the EU Annex 15 has these documents and these activities listed out as requirements. Here's one from the PV guidance, process validation guidance from the FDA in 2011. And really, besides defining it a little bit differently, which I hope everyone is familiar with, the fact that it's now 3 stages of process validation, and it's more of an ongoing, consistent effort through time, and not just 1, 2, 3 batches, you're done, you validated your process and it's good forever. But really, one other thing I wanted to highlight is the fact that the terms installation and operational qualification are not even directly used in the document. So in other words, these things all are driving towards more flexibility, the freedom to define systems that work for your company that are risk-based, and are not prescriptive to the point where you have to have the exact documents with the same titles, or else you're not going to pass your inspection. Just a brief overview of the PV guidance. Like I was just talking about, we've got process design. Really, most people, when they think about process validation, are really right here. What now is called the PPQ. But really, you've got all these different things going on, and then probably the biggest impact, which was always part of predicate rules, but I don't think was ever clearly understood until the guidance. The idea that you have to have continued process verification and monitoring throughout the process lifecycle to make sure that you maintain a state of control. So like I said, everything is driven by knowing and managing your risks. And of course, your process and product variability has to be understood to understand where the risks may lie. So a lot of effort in order to implement these systems, you really do need to have enough information about the processes you're developing to determine those risks and document them accordingly, and then drive the rest of the process forward. So in order to do that, your company has to really invest in knowing their processes. I do see challenges out there in industry when we work with manufacturers of generics in particular, because it's kind of a different submodel of the group where a lot of companies are competing and they license in a certain product, and the speed to market is basically you win the lion's share if you market first, but you buy a process and you don't know very much about it, and so it drives a lot of instances where I've had a hard time drawing out what are the critical process parameters. How do we know what are they, and critical quality attributes are a little easier to identify because it usually comes down to what are the acceptance criteria for whether or not the product passes. But a lot of times there's no real process knowledge to drive, well, how do we actually control the CPPs to get to those levels, and therefore a lot of times you get stuck in that. So that's a little bit of a highlight, just to point out that if you do get into a mode of where you're trying to do this within your company, don't short this part of the process. So moving on, I hope everybody's at least heard of ASTM E2500, but I wanted to show a little bit more about it so the audience could see how these things work together. And the main thing I want to show you is requirements leading to spec design, verification of those requirements being met, and then acceptance and release. And of course, driving inputs to this are, like I was just talking about, product and process knowledge. The regulatory requirements hopefully will be fairly well understood within your company, and then your own company's internal policies and requirements. Once again, as a side note, if regulatory and company requirements are inconsistent, and if you're inspected and you're trying to do all of this implementation, and you find that your company's procedures are not being followed, your argument can't be that it still meets regulatory requirements, because you'll still get enforcement actions for not meeting your own policies. So I definitely encourage that before you jump into the principles that are in here, trying to it's, in my mind, it's exciting and tempting to just start doing things differently when you see new models out here like this that allow you to shortchange the process a little bit. But if you don't take the time to start at the top with your policies, procedures internally, it will end up hurting your company as well. So what is ASTM E2500? Let's clear up the misconceptions a little bit. It is a way to streamline the process. It is based on risk-based and science-based methodology. It's written for the pharma and biopharma industry. Although I would argue that it also covers medical device just as well, even though that we have separate subsets and QSRs for that. And it is a global standard, and it is from 2007, which at this point people may look at and go, well, it's getting a little bit old. But now to kind of come back and say what it's not a creative way of skirting the requirements. It's not necessarily a way to risk assess out essential requirements. So be careful of taking too many shortcuts or trying to argue that, not being realistic about the risk levels that you do have with your products. I guess here I'm saying it's not for use in the medical device industry, so I'm contradicting myself. That's great. But I do think that a lot of these principles apply regardless of what is said. I mean, it's all the same in the end. Patient safety is most important. It's not outdated though. It's really, and from my recent presentations on this topic that I've given and the feedback I've received afterward, I can tell it's not outdated because I know that probably at least 50% of the people I've spoken with were not even aware of it. So I guess it's hard to be outdated if you've never, been current and dated, but I would say it's not outdated. Anyhow, so with a sound methodology like this, why aren't more companies employing this methodology and moving forward? Well, lack of expertise. Like I said, you don't always have enough knowledge of your process to make testable specifications and understand your process well to move that forward. You need someone in your organization or a group, in different key departments in your organization to think big all at the same time. And you may have too many silos in your organization, or silos within them where you're not thinking big enough. Like I said, silos will prevent that. And as we spoke about earlier, a fear of change. It's easier to proceed as always done. It requires a true paradigm shift to make big changes like these happen. And then this is one that we encounter quite a bit, and really is another key to when you start implementing some of these integrated commissioning qualification approaches, is holding vendors accountable for their documentation practices, or internally. But it's usually easier to control your internal employees' documentation practices. But when you start leveraging documents from the commissioning or from the vendor IQ/OQs that a lot of times companies use as their commissioning documents, you really can't use them if you, at the end of the day, they turn over a package of documents that are illegible or have the typical GDP errors in them with, not incorrectly lined out items, or, and on and on. I won't get into that part, but I think everyone's fairly familiar with that. So here's a little, just a little comedy for a second, because I think we can all relate to this. But the whole point of it is really, how do we do this? Less micromanagement, less meetings? I don't know. I just want to spend less money. That's all. Love Dilbert. Let's take a second and let people read it. Okay. So, what are the key features of lean validation? Well, it includes utilizing the key concepts, as I just discussed, in ASTM E2500, focusing on critical aspects of your systems and only direct impact systems. So the more upfront assessment you can have about which of the systems in your facility are actually impacting the product quality directly or have the potential to, the less work you have to do overall. So get more work done up front, chop out as many as you can that are non-impact, no impact, or indirect impact, and qualify accordingly. And then, and really, like I was just saying, eliminating duplicative, non-value added activities. So try to work with your vendors to make them understand that you're attempting to leverage their documentation, and therefore, as a requirement of your purchase or your contract with them, that you need them to present the documents to you in a manner in which they are usable and leverageable, I guess I would say. Focus on leveraging, especially the controls, design, and testing. That's an area, especially complicated area, in which if you end up at not being able to leverage your testing on the control system, then have to go through all your control systems and your PLCs and redo a lot of input-output testing and on all the things that we need to do to make sure those systems work properly. You're going to have, that really drives a lot of extra work. Now, of course, in the qualification phase, we don't want to skip 100% of the controlled design and testing when we're actually doing our IQ, OQ, PQ, because we do want to go back and look at critical aspects or critical alarm systems, et cetera, just to make sure that those that are really critical to quality are working properly. And then embracing, even just going back and embracing some of the commissioning FAT and SAT practices that are common will help you move forward and spend less in your validation efforts, where QA review and approval is always required. So how do you transition? Maybe start a task force. Excuse me. Further keys to implementing lean validation. Like I said before, you got to establish your robust policies and procedures. And let me emphasize here the whole idea of commissioning being a construction phase activity, so that you don't require QA review of every document, like pre-approval, post-approval by QA, except for those systems that are direct impact systems where the commissioning documents really will still be probably need to be quality reviewed. Your procedure should clearly define all of your process qualification activities as post-construction, and then they need to fully define how you're going to leverage commissioning phase documents. They need to give you flexibility. Usually, you need to give flexibility so that you can use a vendor's document format or different things that may not necessarily be exactly as your templates are, but you need that flexibility to pull these documents in, see what valuable activities were already performed, and have justification for not doing them over. So how does lean validation save money? Well, I believe I've touched on these all indirectly, but let's cover them. Cost savings, number one. By focusing on critical aspects only, you're not focusing on all aspects. So therefore, you're obviously chopping out part of the overall effort if you're doing too many things. Like I said, you need to know your CPPs, your CQAs, and a new term, CDE, critical design elements, to move that forward. Leveraging vendor documents can really help you, especially in these certain areas. Like I said, alarms and messages, interlock verification, HMI screens, et cetera, are all a lot of activities that only should really need to be done once. But if you're not leveraging them properly, you will have to repeat them. And they, so why do things twice when you don't have to? By qualifying direct impact systems only, you once again save money there. The last bullet's interesting. The documenting indirect impact system critical aspects in the direct impact system documents is another way to minimize your overall documentation. So it's like, if they're indirect, why not just pull them into something and summarize them, so you've got it, but you're not then making it a separate protocol for each one that's not even directly impacting quality. By utilizing resources more efficiently, and really what we found in our years of working on these types of projects that the best way to do them is to really start out early with a team approach and to work with the construction vendors. And of course, not every company that's implementing lean validation can only do it when they're talking about construction or constructing new large manufacturing facilities. But I would say that those are the types of projects where the biggest cost savings are probably available. Within your current company, when you're doing routine validation, there's still a lot to be gained by minimizing your redundant testing and documentation. But I think it gets magnified even larger when you're talking about greenfield expansion type project with new construction. So in conclusion, the benefits are really fewer documents to be scrutinized by the regulators, and even before that by your internal QA, therefore driving fewer documentation deviations and issues overall. Improved utilization of your technical and QA resources. So if you're not tying up certain key resources in those areas by doing too many reviews or writing too many documents, they can do other things that are possibly more beneficial to your company. Reducing the amount of work will improve your project delivery time, speed to market. You'll actually improve your regulatory compliance because one thing that I would point out is the current regulatory expectations, the C and the CGMP, really are to embrace what's out there now. And so in a sense, the fear of change and the reluctance to move things forward really is not an acceptable excuse anymore, really, because if you're not doing things that are current, you're really risking, the regulators don't want to see you testing all of that. And, it creates more potential for mistakes. So anyway, significant cost savings, up to 70% in certain cases, and more effective, efficient project teams, and therefore happier project teams. Everybody is a little bit happier when they're saving money in the company. And also, I think a lot of morale is improved when people feel like their jobs are more meaningful. And I know I certainly feel this way, and I'm assuming most of the audience members feel this way, which is if you're doing things because you have to and they don't make sense to you, you're not as inspired to actually do your job. Like, oh, I got to do this, but I don't understand why. It doesn't make sense. Well, most rational people understand the concepts in this presentation make sense. They're risk-based, science-based, so therefore you have justifications. And when you're doing things like that, you actually feel good because you feel like you're making smart decisions, not doing things just to do them. So with all of that being said, this is our last poll question, but I wanted to know if you guys feel like your organization's leadership is aware of these concepts. And Valerie, please help me with the poll.
All right. Again, do you feel like your organization's leadership is aware of these concepts? I'll give you guys about another 20 seconds to answer. Our options are yes, absolutely, somewhat, not sure, or absolutely not. And again, there's definitely a clear winner on this one. It's very interesting. So another, let's see here, count to 10, and then I'm going to close this out. I think most of you have voted. All right, and close. Okay, so let's share those results. 18% of you said yes, absolutely. My organization's leadership, they're aware of this. 55% said somewhat. 8% not sure, and 18% absolutely not. So
okay. Yeah.
A for effort and honesty there, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay, so thank you so much for your feedback. That is our last poll. I'm going to go ahead and close this out and hand it back to Jeff.
Okay. Thank you. Absolutely not. Well, I have heard that quite a bit. I'm glad to hear though that I forgot the exact number, but at least significant portion of you said that they're somewhat aware, and I guess that's a start. Here's a quick case study, and I believe that we'll be wrapping up this presentation. We'll take some questions. So one of our clients was and currently is Fujifilm Diosynth, and one of their facilities, they took over a facility and they needed to fast track start up a new facility to support the U.S. pandemic program. So when the U.S. is worried about different vaccines and pandemics, et cetera, and needs to get these things moving, they want to fast track it. They can't wait for the usual process. So, but coming in, they had nothing ready to go. So they required a whole new quality program and commissioning and qualification services from the ground up. In addition to that, they were running very lean internally at this site. So there was absolutely no way that they could have supported. They could barely support what we developed, but there's no way they could have supported a very traditional approach with the limited resources they had at the time and were prepared to spend on it. So compliance teams, our solution, we came in and designed and implemented our Streamline risk-based templates and procedures. Like I said, that's really of utmost importance to do that up front and make sure there's complete buy-in. We provided our project management and subject matter expertise, and we provided them the most cost-effective solution of their facility utilities and process equipment. And as a result, they successfully achieved an on-time and on-budget qualification. And believe me, it was quite a challenge, and we were very excited to be part of it and to help them do that. So really just briefly wanted to say it can be done. Sometimes the best way to get through fear of change and get through the management that's just resistant to change or unaware is to bring in outside experts. So a lot of times your management will listen to people like us better. So definitely open to being invited in to help any viewer to discuss how we can help you with that. But with that, I want to end the presentation and get ready for Q&A.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff. We do have a few questions. I want to encourage anyone who has not typed in their question, there's still plenty of time to type that in. So if you look on your control panel, you will see a questions box or expand that if you need to. And go ahead and type your question, hit send, and we'll take as many questions as we possibly can. All right, both to you, Jeff and Brian. I'll let you guys decide which one wants to take which questions. But our first question is, what area has the biggest potential throughout the industry to improve or implement lean validation? Which is a great question.
I'm gonna let Brian talk for a minute.
I'm sorry, Bob, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, absolutely. What area has the biggest potential throughout industry to improve or implement lean validation? That's a good question from Christopher there.
I think where I see the most place to struggle is implementing strategies around leveraging your commissioning activities, your FAT, SAT, and getting the most out of your vendors. I see companies a lot, they will enforce standards on the commissioning documentation that is basically the standard of an IOQ. And if you're trying to hold your vendors to IOQ standards, you're basically doubling the work. You're essentially saying, we're going to write 2 IOQs instead of writing 1 IOQ. So I think the goal of the risk-based approach is to at least one area where I see people can have the most improvement is just work with the vendors to make sure that the documentation that they're providing meets minimum standards, and then go ahead and leverage that instead of basically writing a second IOQ, which you're trying to leverage into your qualification documentation.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question from Christopher, and this is a really good one, so I'm gonna just bump this one up to the top as well. Is a copy of the ASTM E2500 available online for free, or is there a cost? Now, I know that we at Compliance Team on our website there, we have kind of a checklist for ASTM E2500 that everyone can check out, but the full plan, can one of you answer that one?
I believe it is available online for free. And I would recommend to Chris that you get the full copy, but then get our checklist, because as much as I love the spirit and the content of the standard, it's very, very onerous to read. But I do recommend reading it because it does definitely go into a lot of detail about how to make the division in your documentation system as to where QA, like how do you manage the QA review or not review decision. So it is out there, I believe, publicly available. I'm almost positive, but I still would recommend using something like our checklist to give it a, which we've already spent the time slimming it down and really focusing on the key areas of that. So hope I answered your question.
And I should mention that that's free. So you can go to complianceteaminc.com, click on resources, and it's there for you free to download. No charge. So
yes, ours is definitely free. Yeah.
Yeah, not trying to sell anything there today. Okay. Is it correct to talk about PQ when the study is conducted on a specific operation, and PPQ when the entire process, specific operation forms part of, is challenged?
Can you repeat that one more time? Is it correct or incorrect?
Is it correct to talk about PQ when the study is conducted on a specific operation, and PPQ when the entire process, in parentheses here, a specific operation forms part of, is challenged?
Mm-hmm. I think it is correct. Yeah, I think if you're say you're talking about like a filling operation, and it's obviously an overall part of a larger process of blending, formulating and filling and inspection. The individual operation itself would be still a performance qualification. So it can be considered, if you want to do a PPQ, you could do that. But I think you're correct that it would be appropriate to call that a performance qualification, as it ties into the overall process performance qualification.
Okay.
Brian, do you agree?
Yes, I would agree with that. The PPQ would mostly be talking about your overall process as a whole.
Right.
Okay. Okay, so even when there are multiple sources of guidance for validation, what is the best document to start using to perform a gap assessment in a medical device company?
Oh, wow, that's a good one.
That's a really good one.
As far as a document to drive a gap assessment, I mean, I would probably want to go into more detail or ask more questions about what which gaps you're looking for or what type. I guess
I would
ISPs,
say it's probably an FMEA. An FMEA would probably be your best tool to identify gaps in that perspective.
Gaps and larger risks. Yeah,
it's a useful tool to just identify those gaps, whether you're medical device or pharma.
I would agree with that, because it allows you to assess the risks also within the gaps. So you still got to have something to kind of drive your understanding of what may be gaps, and then assess the severity and the risk of those being important gaps. But
right.
I agree.
You'll usually define your risk mitigation strategy within that document as well.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we actually have I know we're rounding to 3 here, but we're going to keep answering questions. A lot of good questions coming in here. What is the biggest challenge in performing lean validation?
Right.
It really is kind of a culture change. It's kind of one of the reasons Jeff brought up the questions about change within your organization. It's something that kind of needs to be driven from the top down. Seeing that value and working with management to see the value in that can help with that. So I think the biggest challenge there is just recognizing the value, and then you have to get everyone on board with that in order to see the change.
And I would just add on to that, specifically within the quality and or regulatory departments, I think, but in particular the quality group, just I've encountered many cases where they just are not comfortable with not seeing and reviewing and weighing in on everything. So I see it as like when they're too controlling, they're too much in charge. The whole idea is, even in general, I like to think of validation as kind of like the perfect marriage between quality and engineering. And if either side is too in charge and their principles take over, there's an imbalance. And so a lot of times in implementing lean validation, I think that's really, to add on to what Brian's saying, the QA group, well, I don't feel comfortable not seeing that. What if you do all this stuff in there that I don't know about? Well, okay, but the process is designed that way, so really centering on that, to me is really important. But like Brian said, it really starts at the highest levels of leadership to make sure that's understood and communicated down properly.
Right. This is the direction we want to go. So, if you can sell the value of that, or hey, let's try this approach on a new project coming up, just to demonstrate, that we can see a real value. Here's the difference, and you might be able to show a measurable difference to compare a couple projects. So that's one approach that can be taken.
Okay. Was there any regulatory scrutiny or feedback on the Fujifilm simplification project?
We know that it went through several rounds of review from regulatory agencies. There were some minor things that were identified that was specific to their process, but the overall strategy was embraced, and there was no issues with the lean validation approach.
Okay. What is the success rate in perspective of audit findings? Specific to, I think, the compliance team success rate. I think it says, what is your success rate? So.
Well, that's a very good question. And it makes me long for enough data to answer that conclusively. But unfortunately, as I can only do it more of a qualitative, not quantitative, in the fact that we, and let me point out, we don't always get the ability with our clients to do whatever we want or use whichever templates we want. A lot of times we come in and we, ask them what they want to do, and if they're aware of these kinds of things that they can do to save money and time. And then, I commonly hear, we thought about leveraging, but we're not going to do it. Like, okay, well, sort of, going down the path of why and trying to change it. We don't always get to do what we think is appropriate, or at least what is acceptable. But the cases where we have been able to do that and implement it, and we have got the right support for it, I really don't feel that there's been any appreciable amount of audit findings that are, as a result of it, or that they've increased, past what you would expect from any normal operation. Brian, do you think that's also true from your experience?
Yeah, I think where most organizations get into trouble is they're just not following policies and procedures. So they may try to, and I'm not aware of anyone getting in trouble for trying to follow a risk-based or a lean validation approach. It could just be that they did not document in their policy and procedure appropriately what their plans are or how to do this. And so it may look like they weren't following policies or procedure to do that. So that's where it kind of comes from. You have to drive it from the top down and say, and change your policy to procedure to say, this is the way we're going to do things here as an organization. And that way it'll be embraced by everyone, and there won't be any trouble with the regulatory agency. They'll see that this is the approach you laid out, this is the quality system you've designed, and it's going to follow a risk-based approach following these principles. And as long as you're following that, there shouldn't be any trouble.
All right. How much does the ASTM E2500 overlap into the medical device industry? And is there any tips on running lean validations in this industry?
I guess I would say I view things holistically, and I think that the concepts that we've discussed today are directly applicable to medical device, because ultimately, the FDA is the same body reviewing both sides, and even with QSR 820, having been issued after the CFR 210 and 211 and other documents, that those expectations were also applicable to pharma, in the same manner. So I view it as, when you're talking about, obviously in medical device, a lot of times you're doing more of a product design instead of a process, but really the same things are applicable. How much knowledge do you have of your product and which aspects are critical? If you can identify those up front, you can still focus your qualification efforts on the critical aspects only. And so I believe that they're directly applicable in medical device. And so that's what I think.
And I would add to that in my experience at most medical device companies, they're kind of already following a lean approach to begin with. A lot of medical devices do not go down the rabbit hole of, creating gobs and gobs of paperwork and validating everything. Most medical devices were already kind of looking at critical aspects and doing risk assessment to make sure that only the critical stuff is being done. So I've actually kind of seen that medical device companies actually are kind of ahead of most pharma from that perspective, because they never went down the road of going too far.
Right. One thing I would say though is I know a lot of pharma companies now technically have become medical device companies as well, because of the combination products that they're developing, and so that may be a case in which you got a traditional pharma mindset, and you all of a sudden you're developing medical devices, but you're still following some of the older models. So if you're in a company like that, that might be the reason why. But I think I agree with Brian. If most of our true medical device manufacturers that kind of came up in that area have a better handle on risk-based, science-based approach, I think partially because of when their QSR and ISO 1345 and other documents were issued a little bit later in the overall later in history, or early, later. Yeah.
Okay. Correct. And I've been trying to filter through these as I read them. So if I've read this one already, correct me. But even when there are multiple sources of guidance for validation, what is the best document to start using to perform a gap assessment in a medical device?
We did that one.
We did that. I thought so. See, there we go. All right. I didn't clear that one out when I did. All right. Let's see here. Kind of last call for questions. How has this methodology, how does it comply with Anvisa and Coefficient, and I'm probably botching that, sorry, regulation?
What did you say?
COFEPRIS. My apologies. I'm the monitor or the MC today, not the subject matter expert. So the COFEPRIS regulation, where the demand just a checklist of documents. You want me to repeat that one?
I'm having trouble. I can't see it, so I'm having trouble. But Brian, you're catching it?
Comply with ANVISA, ANVISA in COFEPRIS regulation.
Brian, you got anything on this? I honestly, I couldn't answer that directly. I apologize, but I'm not particularly familiar with those regulations, especially not seeing it. It's not coming to mind.
Okay. What we can do actually to the person who asked that question, we will research that and we will get back with you.
Yeah, can we get back to you? Because we do have our internal regulatory expert, our other director, Regina Fullen, would probably have a much longer answer and more appropriate answer for that. But I'm not familiar with that at the moment.
Very good. And I know I botched that one word. My apologies. I have a new word to learn today, even in my role. So, okay, let's see here. We did have a few people ask, will I get a copy of this presentation? And the answer is absolutely. You will receive a follow-up survey just to hopefully give us some feedback. We thank you. There's a couple little technical things today, and we thank you for working with us through that. And we will send a link also to the recording of this webinar and the presentation so you can share it with your colleagues, and hopefully it's a great resource, continues to be a great resource for you as well. Other than that, I think that's it. So I just want to say from all of us, thank you for spending your time with us today. We hope it is worthwhile, and if you would like to connect with Jeff, if you think of a question you want, end of the day, you're like, oh, geez, I should ask that. Please email him, jcarbon@complianceteaming.com. Brian Van Bibber is just B Van Bibber, just like it sounds. And if Brian can answer better, Jeff will pass on over. You can also connect with Jeff on LinkedIn, on linkedin.com/in/Jeff Carbon. We encourage you to check out complianceteaming.com. There's a lot of, we mentioned the ASTM E2500 checklist. There's a lot of free resources on the website. And check out us on LinkedIn. We try to keep updates rolling out there. And when new webinars are launched, we'll also be sharing that information, as well as our bi-monthly industry newsletter. So without any further ado, anything else, Jeff or Brian?
Nothing. Just wanted to thank everybody that participated today, and I hope that it was beneficial, and maybe you have a new perspective now and kind of moving things forward within your company, or how to go about it. So I appreciate your time, and I am really open to being contacted if you'd like to further the discussion. So otherwise, have a great day, and thank you very much.
Have a good one, everyone. Thanks
I'll
again.
say the same. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Boom.